All right, the recording is started. Here we go. We are on the going to be reading the last paragraph of the 9th letter, and we're going to get into the 10th letter. But before we jump into the text, does anyone have some old business? Anything you want to bring up from last week? The intervening
about
time? Go ahead, John.
in that particular paragraph, but since you're going to go through it, I'll hold my thoughts.
Okay, that works. Anybody else? Anything you've been processing? Anything you want to talk about before we get into new material? All righty then, here we go. I wanted to go back one paragraph, last paragraph of the 9th letter, page 66, just because it's one of those really well done paragraphs. And this 9th letter was such a how-to on contemplative practice and centering prayer and presence and all of that. So he just hit a lot of really good points. I would dog ear that 9th letter. And if you are trying to put a structure together for your own centering prayer or meditation, and you're having difficulties or you start to hit the wall, go back and reread that letter because it's really got a lot packed in there that I think can help. But this last paragraph, let's just read it again. He says, and remember who he's talking to. He's talking to, is that the Reverend Mother? Yeah, the Reverend Mother. And she's someone that he's had this long-standing relationship with and friendship with, and he's been coaching her along the way. And she's obviously hit the wall. So he's responding to her and trying to get her back on track. And at the very end, he says, we cannot avoid the dangers and perils with which life abounds without the actual and unceasing help of God. Let us ask his help continually. This is classic Brother Lawrence. He doesn't believe that he does anything worthwhile except that God does it through him, which is the same sentiment that Jesus has when he says, I don't do anything of my own initiative, only what the Father does through me. And so here he is just restating that again. How can we ask? So here's the idea. We can't avoid the dangers. We can't deal with what life dishes out without the actual and unceasing help of God. So let us ask his help continuously. Well, how do we do that? How can we ask for his help unless we are with him? Obvious, right? How can we be with him except by thinking of him often? How can we think of him often except by forming a holy habit of doing so? So there is the bits and pieces that he's laying out. We can't do anything without God's help. We need to ask him continuously. And we can't ask him continuously unless we're actually with him. Now, obviously, God is everywhere, and wherever we are, we're with God. And Brother Lawrence knows that. The famous line that he said, even if I find myself in hell, I'm still with God, and it's going to be transformed into a paradise. But even though God is always with us, we're not always with God. And so we need to be able to actually be present to God's everlasting presence. And so that's what he's talking. We can't ask for help. We can't, and it's not a matter of asking God for something that he's withholding otherwise until we ask correctly or ask at all. But it's that the help is always there. God's presence is always there. And as soon as we turn toward it, as soon as we connect with it, we are empowered with that presence to be able to deal with the circumstances that are present to us. And we can't do that unless we are aware of that presence. We are present to that presence. And how can we be with him except by thinking of him often? So how do we gain that awareness, that conscious awareness of presence? Well, it's by... Now, this doesn't necessarily mean in words, calling him to mind, but it does mean that we are aware without thinking. We have that conscious awareness of presence. And it also means that we are tuned into all the distracting thoughts. And that's probably the most important thing. If we are scattered, if our mind is pinging around like the inside of a popcorn machine, then there's no way that we're going to be able to be aware of presence. We're not going to be dialed into the moment. And so thinking of him, being aware of him. And how can we do that? How can we think of him often? Except by forming a holy habit of doing so. So this is something that we're going to need to habitually be doing over and over and over again until it actually forms this habit. And what we're doing when we form a habit is actually creating new neural pathways and reinforcing them by repeated action, repeated experience of the same thing. And then that really forms the habit for us. So that's what he's talking about.
Dave, you just said that we must act correctly. What does that mean?
I didn't say act correctly, did I?
Ask.
Ask correctly. I said, no,
Ask correctly. Well, what's that?
I'm saying we don't need to do that.
Oh,
I'm saying God isn't up there withholding the things that we need from us until we ask correctly. That's not the way it works. God withholds nothing. Everything that God is spread out everywhere. And everywhere we go, we are traipsing through all of God's stuff because it's everywhere all the time. So it's not like we have to ask correctly in order for the floodgates to be opened. But by asking God's help, that's a letting down of our guard. So if we use the words and pray that short prayer, God, I need you right now. I need your help right now. Help me with this right now. What that is bringing your attention back to the focus of the moment, the problem that's in the moment, and God's presence that's in the moment. It brings you and focuses you down. And so it's not that it's a bad thing to use words and ask. That can be the very thing that helps you like a laser to reconnect. But it's not the asking in words that does it. It's not like a magic incantation that opens God's floodgates. It's bringing us back into the presence that's already here, the resources that are already around us, the empowerment that's already at our feet. So that's the idea. So it's not about asking correctly, although asking can be a very powerful thing. Those short prayers, those little one-liners, those can be really powerful to just bring us back, bring us back, bring us back. And it's also an acknowledgement of our humility, our powerlessness, right? It's an acknowledgement that we are independent. It's taking us out of the pride arena. It's also taking us past our illusions of self-sufficiency and all that stuff that goes on in our minds. Those little short prayers can be very powerful for that. Does that make
So
more
it's
sense,
asking
Roy?
without expectation, right?
No, it's asking with expectation, but not with the
Then-
expectation that God is going to grant passively the thing we're asking for. But-
Yes, I'm sorry, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Okay, yes, it's not
Yep.
like that. It's that we will be able to actively engage in God's presence and then be able to use the empowerment that's already there. Is that making sense?
Yes.
I know it's a kind of a fine point, but it makes all the difference in the world. So anyway, I love the way that he set this up. How can we think of him often except by forming a holy habit of doing so? So it's like anything else that we want to do. You want to establish a workout routine. Hey, it's going to be holy hell for the first month or two until you form the habit. And then it becomes the holy habit, right? You're going to have to push through the resistance. You're just going to have to keep showing up, even though you're not seeing any results, and just keep coming back and coming back. And over time, it gets easier and easier to do so. You're not questioning yourself when the alarm goes off. It's just the alarm goes off, you get up and you go. And it's just part of your routine now. And then you start seeing the changes that you're looking for. And then that reinforces and so on and so forth. But it's going to be like that. And it's going to be the same thing with staying mindful. It's going to be the same thing with trying to stay present to God. We need to keep doing it all throughout the day. And the more we do it, the quicker we form the holy habit.
Dave, this is, I highlighted this particular sentence when I was reviewing this last letter. And the line, so the sentence says, how can we think of him often except by forming a holy habit of doing so? And then I put in the margin, I said, this is practicing presence to me. I mean,
Amen.
this is, in a nutshell, that's what it is.
Absolutely.
And I'm really elated because every morning, my first I don't want to say cogent thought, but my first awareness is to say thank you for another day, God. And that's before anything, just as I open my eyes, And then I say a short prayer, and then I get out of bed and I put one foot in front of the other and let him take care of the results. And I have learned in the past that my feelings are that he's not standing behind us, like a daddy teaching his little son how to ride his bicycle with the training wheels on it, helping him along and pushing him. But he's there if I ask. I mean, that's been my experience.
Mhm. Well, the truth is, Johnny's there if you don't ask. But if you ask, you might
Yeah.
you might actually become aware that
He's I'm fully aware of the fact that he is there and he is aware.
Uh-huh.
It's just, in my experience, it's a matter of having prayers answered, not asking for things, but for the awareness,
hmm
knowledge of his will for me. And you know where that comes from.
That's
So-
great, buddy. That's it. That's it. And that's where those little short prayers can be very focusing and very powerful. So it's not that we don't pray with words, but we don't need a lot of them. That's what Jesus said. Don't use a lot of words. Your Father knows what you need before you ask. Just show up. Go off into your little closet, into your little place, and be completely alone. This is not for display, for others to see how pious you are. Just retreat and be. Be still and know, right? Now, the next line I love here. He's anticipating. Have you ever written a letter and you're thinking about the other person reading it and you're actually anticipating what their reaction is going to be to what you're saying? This is what he's doing here. You will tell me that I'm always saying the same thing to you. It's true. Because he's basically a one-trick pony. He says, I do not know of an easier or more appropriate method. And as I practice no other, I recommend it to everybody. So this is what he's doing. This is what he does. It's simple. It works for him. And so it's what he recommends to anybody who's going to ask him. Anybody who's going to ask him, he's going to say the same thing. But Jesus did the same thing. Jesus was a one-trick pony too. He said the same thing over and over and over in as many different ways as he could possibly think of to try to get light bulbs turned on over people's heads. Metaphor after metaphor, story after story, right? So this is the same thing. But I just love that he's probably seen her roll her eyes once or twice before in conversation. What's that great line? Behind every great man stands a woman rolling her eyes, something like that. All right, and then
Marion?
I'm sorry, what?
I was asking Marion if that was true.
Oh yeah. This last little bit, we must know before we can love. Now there's a statement. To know God, we must think of him often. And when we come to love him, we shall also think of him very often. For our heart is where our treasure is. Let us ponder this often and deeply. So we must know before we can love. Just quickly, do you agree with that statement?
No, what exactly?
You must know the beloved. I would assume this is what he's talking about.
We must, what was the rest of that?
We must know before we can love. Now he's talking about God here, right? But I think it can be expanded to a human being, anybody, maybe even your dogs and your cats. If we go back to the actual definition of love that we've been using, whether you agreed with it or not, it's the one I've been using, is that love is not a feeling and love is not behavior. And Thomas Merton's definition is that love is identification with the beloved. When we actually identify with another person, right? We see them as a fellow human being with the same rights and the same privileges and everything else that we have. And we don't see any separation or distance between us, then everything we do to or for that person is as if we did it to ourselves. And vice versa. When we do something to ourselves, it's as if we did it to another person. And if we continue that kind of basic golden rule behavior long enough, feelings of affection can follow. But what starts the whole ball rolling, whether it's love or whether it's forgiveness, it begins with identification with the other. We need to see them as an extension of ourselves. We need to know them well enough to know that they are a fellow human being, imperfect, sometimes broken, but they're a fellow human being who deserves everything that we deserve. So I do think that that is true, not in the sense of knowing intellectually, not having factoids about the person, but knowing in the Hebrew sense of intimate experience. That's what Hebrew knowing is. It comes from the word for hand, yada, which means to handle something, to, you know, to know someone the way a carpenter knows his or her tools. They can feel the weight in their hands from long experience. That's the way we know. When we get to that point, then love is the byproduct of that kind of knowing. So I think he's correct there. But you may not. But
What did
anyway,
say-
this is a packed
it-
paragraph. Go ahead, Lori.
What did you just say, the Hebrew? It's Hebrew what?
Yada. Y-A-D-A. Yada.
So it's
It starts with the Hebrew letter Yod, which in the original pictogram was a picture of a hand, an actual picture of a hand. So that what transliterates to Y for us, the Yod, is the first letter of the word for hand, which has also come then to mean to know in the sense of intimate experience.
so just to clarify, so it's not the intellectual knowing, it's knowing what the person as a person.
Yes.
What is, yeah, because when the first time I met each of my daughter, I was already in love with them without knowing them, not knowing their personality.
No, but you don't know the personality, but you know, I think a mother, that's the unique relationship a mother has with children that fathers don't have, to carry that child. There's something that you know about them.
Mm.
You know,
So my
there's
children-
there's an intimate knowing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So my children are adopted, but I already knew I love this baby, regardless of anything,
Okay, I think that was
regardless.
there was a choice there that you were making to love and care for and have affection for, but I know that that love has deepened in ways that you couldn't imagine as you got to actually know that baby over time, and as they became more known to you with experience. But yeah.
Mm.
So Dave, I'm thinking of something also on this. I'm thinking of two different scenarios. One, I have some friends from other cultures that actually were in arranged marriages, and I know probably some of you know arranged marriages too.
Mhm.
And they've told the stories that they really obviously didn't know the person very well when they were married to them. But as I think you're saying, as they grew and grew together, and then I started to maybe identify with one another, the love grew over the years, you know, in those cases. And then I think of a traditional couple that maybe is getting to know one another, you're dating, you're courting, whatnot. You know, you start to see behaviors of that person, you start to see how they are, you start to maybe identify with those things and say, well, that's a very lovely quality about them. I'm falling more and more in love with them in that way. But then I think about it in relation to God. I mean, we don't really get to see those traditional behaviors of the person that grows on you over a period of time. It's a different kind of getting to know. And I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's more challenging, I think, because you're saying I mean, he's saying here, think about him often, think about him often. And I guess we can think about someone often and continue to love them more and more as we think about them, but the God factor, it seems so big and enormous that how do I identify with that exactly?
But
And
that's
so
the point, Kathy. We're not trying to identify with that big, awesome, you know, universe creating God. What we're identifying with is the God that's in the moment with us right now. And
The
to think
small
about
stuff.
God is really to call God back into your awareness. You know, we can go the whole day without even thinking about anything remotely spiritual. We are just going with our nose from tree to tree to tree. We never see the forest because we're just detail, 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 and we're so spun out. But to call God back to awareness is to think of him. It doesn't mean about words. It means to just come back into the awareness that God stands behind all of these details.
Mhm.
And if we're thinking about the God who created the universe, that's just an intellectual construct. That's not the
Right.
kind of knowing we're talking about. But when you sink into a moment that completely immerses you, and let's think about Ellen swimming yesterday. You know, she goes by the pool. She hasn't swum in over a decade. She used to love it as a kid. And she just decides, I'm going to go swimming. And she gets in that water and it envelops her and she's crying just because of all the flood of everything that was coming back. That's a God moment where we can know God and know that feeling of being enveloped and know that feeling of being cared for and cared about. But you can't put it into words, but it's going to be down to that. That's why Brother Lawrence is so adamant about, it's not about what you consider significant moments that connect you to God. It's all the tiny little moments in between that you're just passing over to get to the significant ones. I can pick a straw up off the ground for the love of God, and it's a sacred act. I can turn the cake that's frying in the pan, and I'm connected to God. So when we get down to seeing God in those mundane and inconsequential moments, now we're starting to know something about the unassuming God, the humble God, the God that is our servant, the one we were talking about on Sunday. When we can start seeing God as Jesus portrayed the Father through his own life and model, now we're seeing something completely different. And I think that is the unseen spirit that we can know through these kinds of experiences, if we make that connection.
Nice.
Makes sense. I get it.
I had a couple of thoughts that popped into my head. One of them was this whole namaste idea that Hindus use, you know, like the divinity in me bows to the divinity in you. You know, and when you were reading the Brother Lawrence stuff, it kind of sparked that thought. And I was also thinking of this Sufist concept that to know yourself is to know God. Right? And the more you know yourself, the more you can, the way I understand that is the more you know your true self, which is different from your egoic self, is to know God. And to know that self and be with that self and see that self in another person and see that divine part of myself in another divine child, and knowing that I'm having a divine interaction when I'm talking to another human being, whether I recognize it or not, and bringing that awareness to the fact that we're two of God's souls are interacting in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Just trying to honor that in that moment.
Now, if that sounds weird to you, just remember that Genesis tells us that we are created in God's image. It is that deeper self that is the part of us that's created in God's image. So when we get to know that self, when we can step away from the egoic mind that covers that self over with all of our thoughts and all of our illusions, then we are getting to know God's image. We're getting to know God. I mean, it's that simple, and it's scriptural as well. So this is really what we're talking about here. You know, when he says that we must know before we can love, you know, he's trying to get people to place immense importance on the practice of presence, because that begins the whole ball of wax. If we don't develop the habit of practicing presence, we will never become aware of our deepest self in connection with God's presence, our presence to God's presence. And so how in the world are we going to ever be able to experience any of this? You know, Kathy brought up arranged marriages, and I often use this in wedding ceremonies when I marry people, because they're so different. We can't imagine how an arranged marriage is anything but abusive and brutal, right? To make somebody marry someone else, make your daughter marry someone she's never met before, and because it's just a politically arranged or bringing families together. How does that even work? We think of true love and finding our soulmate and love at first sight or whatever it is, but we've got to feel the romantic connection, and we got to be the ones who pick out our mates. We're not going to have anyone pick out a mate for us. And yet our divorce rate is 50%, and arranged marriages are much more stable than our marriages are. Now, yes, the culture reinforces those, and there's that. But an Easterner said that, you people in the West, you take hot soup and put it in a cold plate and it slowly becomes cold. We take cold soup and put it in a pan over the fire and slowly it becomes hot. Because they don't look at marriage as the place where we come to act out the love that we've found. They look at marriage as the place where we learn how to love, because we're learning to know each other at the same time. Now, that doesn't mean that a lot of arranged marriages aren't great, of course. But it's a different way of looking at this whole thing. To know before we can love is what the arranged marriage experience would be more like than the way we go about romantic love in the West.
Mhm.
Just more stuff to think about, but understand why he's making the point, because he wants to make sure that we put ultimate importance on practicing presence, because it's the beginning of love. It's the beginning of our ability to love not only God, but each other. Have we beaten that horse enough? Okay.
I think culture does matter though, because my grandparents had an arranged marriage and it was miserable. And so I think cultural norms really do make a difference with that.
Well, of course they do. And you're always going to find the exception to the rule. But in general, the arranged marriages do tend to last longer and be more stable. But like you said, you do have the culture reinforcing it, whereas our culture doesn't seem to reinforce anything anymore. But
Hey, but I'll go for an arranged marriage. If somebody had somebody great, okay, I'm putting it in your hands. There you go.
all right. Okay.
Yep.
Just make sure it's not William who's arranging your marriage. Okay?
Hey, I trust William.
That's great. Okay,
Trouble
Right.
start. Oh,
let's turn the page. Actually, you don't have to turn the page. Just look at the other side of the page. Page 67, the 10th letter. Okay. This is to Mrs. N. So this is a new letter recipient. We don't know who she is. The N is just for name. But this is going to be a lay person, not religious, not a nun. Okay. He says, Madame, I have had a great deal of difficulty in bringing myself to write to Mr. DN. Okay, so this is a man, and but not her husband. I do so only because you and Mrs. DN, his wife, want me to do so. Take the trouble then to put the address on my letter and send it to him. I love the little details that crop up. Okay, so let's set the stage here. What's going on? We're going to find out in the next couple of paragraphs that Mr. DN has lost a friend. He's had a friend in life, and I assume it was a male friend. We don't really know. I think maybe he's referred to as male later on. But a friend died, and he is in what we can maybe call extended grief or complicated grief at this point. He's not getting over it. All right. So basically, Brother Lawrence is being called in for an intervention, or at least an intercession. They can't seem to get him through the grief. They can't comfort him. And so they're asking Brother Lawrence if he could give it a try. I found it interesting why he says, I've had a great deal of difficulty in bringing myself to write to this man. I do so only because you and Mrs. DN want me to. Doesn't explain why he's feeling this reluctance. We can maybe, speculate a little bit. Maybe he doesn't know the man very well. Maybe he feels uncomfortable being put in this kind of middle position as a counselor. Who knows? But for some reason, he feels uncomfortable in taking this on. And he has written the letter though to this man, and he's put it inside the letter that he's giving to Mrs. N and asking her to readdress it and send it to the man. Then he says, I'm very pleased with the trust you have in God. I hope he will ever increase it. We cannot put too much trust in so good and faithful a friend who will never betray us in this world or the next. So this is how he sees God. He sees God as a faithful and good friend who will never betray us. Unlike our human friends that we always have to wonder a little bit about, God will never betray us in this world and the next. So he's pleased with Mrs. N and her ability to be trusting in God. And he just hopes that that will continue to increase. He continues, if Mr. N can take advantage of the loss he has suffered and put his trust completely in God, he will soon give him another friend, more powerful and more favorably inclined. Okay, let's break this apart because that sounds, I don't know if that sounds a little weird to you. It sounded a little weird to me, right? First of all, this idea of if he could take advantage of the loss that he has suffered and put his trust completely in God. The other translation that I talk about often is if he knows how to profit from the loss he has suffered and put his trust completely in God. Can any of you riddle me that? What is he talking about? What is this taking advantage of a loss like this, or figuring out how to profit from a loss like this that will allow him to put his trust in God? Or if he does this and put his trust in God? From all that we've read over these last few books, does anything ring out for you?
So what rings to me is you use your pain for a purpose. You use your suffering for a purpose. Maybe to help somebody else. Yeah. That's how I interpret it.
Okay. And
Or
any idea
perhaps
what that purpose is?
Likely to help somebody else. I mean,
Okay.
who else, let's say I went through depression or going through depression, who else can help the other person with depression more than the person who's gone through it?
Okay. Okay. Judy, were you saying something?
Yeah, I was kind of piggybacking on Alan's thought there that, I think as you open yourself up to the grief and stop resisting it
Mm.
and realizing that God is carrying you, that you're almost kind of having to fall into his arms, to bear the pain, and to let it have its way with you, so to
Mhm.
speak, and to use it, to transform yourself, because I think we do become softer, gentler, more caring human beings as we move forward through the grief.
That's great. Both of you have given us two facets of all this.
Okay, I'm not there. I'm in the middle of this complicated grief with the loss of my husband. And right now, I don't have somebody that I can help with the loss, and I'm not understanding. I don't understand. It doesn't feel like I'm resisting. I just don't get what you're talking about. I'm lost.
Okay.
You may be helping more people than you know.
I don't know.
Dave,
There's-
is he talking about God or another human friend?
He's talking
He
about
will
a
soon
human
give
friend.
him another friend. Does that mean a human friend?
I believe
or-
he means, yes, a human friend.
Okay.
I read it as God.
It could be that too. It's a little amorphous.
Because that's a bold promise to make.
It's a very bold
Yeah.
promise to make. But if we turn it around, because once again, it's always the way that we express things generally. God is the actor. God's always the actor, whether it's the Old Testament and God is leveling cities and committing genocide, or God is answering prayers and healing. God is always the actor, but the truth of the matter, God has already acted. He's done everything that he can possibly do. It's up to us to act in resonance with God, and then the connections are made. And so if we turn that around, do you remember in the last book, Richard Rohr, Falling Upward, he said there are two paths to spirituality and to this second half of life experience. Do you remember that? What the two paths were? It was great suffering and great love. Those are the two paths. Now, why is it that those are the two paths to this greater awareness of spiritual maturity? It's because both of those are intense enough to blow everything else out like candles on a birthday cake. Great suffering and great love have the ability to clear the decks, to blow out all of the assumptions we've made, all of the belief systems, all of the core beliefs, because suddenly they don't amount to a hill of beans in terms of what we're feeling right now. Either that great pain and that great loss, or that great love and great connection. And they are tools for us when they occur on their own, because we don't control either one of them. But when they present themselves in our life and they clear the decks, they give us a view of a there that we couldn't see before. We can see that's like pulling the curtain aside for a moment so that we can see that there's another there out there. And that allows us then to have something to go for, to realize that what we believed had closed over on itself and we thought that's all there was. But there's this whole other there out there that we hadn't even considered. But we have to get all of that stuff aside, and great suffering and great love can do that. And that allows us to take next steps. So I think what he's talking about here is if this man could take advantage of the loss he suffered by allowing it to do its work in him, to clear out what it was that he was attached to in this particular friendship that was so important to him, and maybe we could even say was so codependent in him that it was limiting him from being able to grow further, that then he could put his trust in something larger, and he would get a greater friend than the one that he thought he had and the one that he lost. And if whether that friend is God himself, unseen God, or another human being, I don't know that it matters hugely, but that he would find greater and greater connection as he goes forward, if he allows, kind of as Judy said, allows that grief to do its work in him and to let him be purged of all of his assumptions, or at least some of them. Is that washing with anybody out there?
It's like getting a situation done to be able to look at it that way.
Okay. It's a tough concept, all right? And Lori, I can't imagine anything I just said was all of that comforting. It's not going to be intellectual. There's really nothing you can say to someone who's in grief that's going to make it all better. And anything you try to say will just trivialize the pain and the grief and the nature of the relationship in the first place. So it's not about an intellectual understanding of meaning. It's an experiential understanding of meaning. A few months ago, I read a piece from a chaplain who was talking about the fact that meaning, as we understand meaning, a meaning that you can actually put into words that's rational, logical, breaks down right at the point of intense crisis or imminent death. That at those moments when it's so intense, meaning has no meaning, basically. But what we do get as we move through these intensities are what she called momentary glimpses of something greater, momentary glimpses of something beyond. And as you stitch those together, as you move forward in life, it starts to make a different kind of sense, a different kind of meaning. but you can't put it into words. It's what you know and what you become convinced of. And it's what you're living and what you're experiencing. But it doesn't fit neatly into a soundbite.
It breaks down at intense crisis and intense what?
Intense crisis or in imminence of death. So at end of life and in intense crisis, this idea of meaning breaks down. You can't articulate it. And it would actually be abusive to try to impose it at those moments. But that doesn't mean what Ellen was talking about is finding meaning so that you can turn that around and you can use it to help somebody else, and that can give you purpose back and meaning back. But that occurs after, sometime after, after you're out of shock, after you're out of denial, after the air temperature has cooled a bit. Now you can return yourself to some kind of rational meaning. But in the moment itself, no, it's just not, it's not possible to do that. But that's the power of it, because it's really cleared all this stuff out.
But I think Brother Lawrence would argue that you can find meaning in the moment, in the midst of the suffering.
I doubt it would be logical or rational or something you put into words. It may sound that way from the way he's writing, but just knowing the way that contemplative processes work, and after having read enough contemplatives and mystics, you get the sense that all of this stuff is experiential, but it's not intellectual. And once you put it into words, you've stepped away from it. But that doesn't mean you can't find meaning in the moment of crisis, but it's not going to be something that you can put on a bumper sticker, if that helps. We don't have to agree with all this stuff. Don't worry about that, and definitely put it in the meat grinder and keep grinding on it and see where you come out. But I think if you look at the motive behind what he's writing and what he's trying to say, there is still purpose, even in the pain. And if he could find that purpose, find that meaning, then he's going to be able to go on, and he's going to have more friends, that are going to fill in. It won't be the same as the friend he lost, but he will accommodate the loss and be able to continue to live richly. Now he's going to go on and he's going to talk about that this friendship that this man had that he can't get over, maybe that was what was out of balance. And that's the reason, because it really was toxic in a way. So he's going to delve into that next as part of his arguments here. But looking beneath just the debate that we can have over the statements themselves, if we look past them to the reason that he is speaking this way and trying to make these points, it's all going to come back down to the practice of presence, because that's his Johnny One Note. That's the thing he says over and over again. So basically he's saying, if this man in his grief could still find God's presence, could still practice that presence, could look through the grief into the connection in the moment, he's going to find something there that's going to be transformative, which is kind of what Judy was saying too, right? Yeah. Okay, let's look at this next line, because it's also very confusing. So starting from the top of the paragraph, if Mr. DN can take advantage of the loss that he has suffered and put his trust completely in God, he will soon give him another friend, more powerful and more favorably inclined. He disposes of hearts as he pleases. Okay, now this is capital H, so he's talking about God again. He disposes of hearts as he pleases. And maybe that gives more credence in context to what William was saying, or somebody was saying, that they assume that the friend that he will get that's more powerful will be God himself. But God disposes of hearts as he pleases. Now that probably sounds really weird to us, because colloquially, to dispose means to throw something out, right? That's the way we typically use it. We're going to dispose of this. We're going to throw it out. But dispose has a secondary meaning, which is the one that's being used here. And it's to bring into a particular frame of mind or a particular attitude, to persuade, to incline, or to encourage. So that's what we're talking about here. God can bring hearts into a different attitude or frame of mind or experience as he pleases. So what he's saying is that this change of disposition, this change of perspective that he's talking about, that this man needs to take, he's going to do it in concert with God, and God can make that change happen at any time. Now, the way we're looking at things, God has already done everything he can do for this man or for any one of us. But as soon as this man turns and connects with God's presence, that disposition can take place. That change of attitude can take place anytime, any moment. Okay. Make sense?
Yeah.
Now we
Letter
can-
he
oh,
wrote
go
to the
ahead.
guy- We don't have that letter, right? The letter he wrote to Mr. D.
No, in fact, my note at the end of this is I want that letter. Not only do I want that letter, I would want to hear what was he saying or what could he say to that man's wife. Wouldn't that be fascinating to see? How would he counsel her? Because she's got to be, completely spun. She's got a husband who can't stop grieving over another friend other than her outside of the marital relationship. That's got to hurt. I would love to see how he spoke to her as well as how he spoke to him, but nope, we don't get that stuff. Unfortunately. Okay, so to continue, he says God disposes of hearts as he pleases. Perhaps Mr. de N was inordinately attached in a worldly way to the friend he has lost. Oh, okay. He's basically calling him codependent, right? Or maybe even that there was maybe some sort of romantic attachment. I mean, we can speculate all sorts of things here. But at any rate, he's saying that maybe the relationship itself was unbalanced in some way. And that is what's giving rise to the grief that he can't get rid of. Then he continues, we ought to love our friends, but without prejudicing the love of God, which must come first. And prejudicing is kind of another word that we're not used to hearing used in this way, but maybe we could substitute damaging or compromising. We ought to love our friends, but without damaging or compromising the love of God, which must come first. Remember, I beg you, what I have recommended to you, which is to think often of God, which is to call God into our awareness, not necessarily just think in words, by day, by night, in all your pursuits and duties, even during your recreations. God is always near you and with you. Do not leave him alone. I love that, right? And then he uses this wonderful analogy. You would think it rude to leave a friend alone who came to visit you. Why abandon God and leave him alone? Isn't that great? Because God is always here. God is always visiting. God is always knocking at the door. We wouldn't leave a visitor to our home alone. Why would we do it to God? And this idea, he is always near you and with you. Do not leave him alone. This is another hallmark characteristic of Brother Lawrence, that God is here immediately, intimately, always. He is never far away. Sometimes we casually call God the big guy upstairs, or we think of him. What was that song by Bette Midler that I've always hated? That he loves us from a distance.
From a distance.
Oh God, I hate that song. It is just the worst theology. God is watching from a distance. No, God is right here. He's immanent. He's attached to us. And, that doesn't mean that he's pulling all the strings of everything that happens to us, but he's still here and he's still knowable. And this is Brother Lawrence. He is always near you. He's always with you. He's always present. He's always immanent, intimate. And this is, I think, why Jesus started calling his father Abba, which is the word that children use to denote the affection and the intimacy of their physical father. He was trying to connote that to the people he was teaching by the very use of the word. Imagine hearing that for the first time, how shocking it must have been to hear Jesus calling the King of the universe Daddy, essentially. But that level of intimacy is what Jesus was all about. And that's what kingdom is all about, is being able to live and experience that level of intimacy. And that's what Brother Lawrence is all about. Why abandon God and leave him alone? Do not forget him. Think of him often. Again, call to awareness. Adore him continually. In other words, I would translate that. Be grateful. Be grateful for everything and be aware of your dependence on God in everything that occurs, everything that accrues to you. To adore him is to be grateful and to acknowledge the gifts. Live and die with him. That is the glorious business of a Christian. The other translation says that is the beautiful call of a Christian. So whatever works best for you. In a word, it is our calling. If we do not know that calling, we must learn it. I will help you with my prayers. I am in our Lord, yours, etc., etc., etc. From Paris, October 29, 1689. This last couple of lines of this letter is basically Brother Lawrence's elevator speech. Remember we were talking about elevator speeches a while back? You know, can you condense everything about whatever it is, you know, what you're selling, your job, your mission in life, your purpose, your faith. If you can condense it down in the time it takes to get from one floor to the next, when the doors open again, that's your elevator speech. And this is it. Think of God often, adore him continually, live and die with him. That's the glorious business of a Christian. In a word, it is our calling. And if we do not know that calling, we got to learn it. That's it. You want to know what being a Christian means to Brother Lawrence? That's it. One sentence. He's got it all down. It's that call to presence, a constant call to presence. Everything Brother Lawrence does, if you've ever worked with a business consultant, you know, what they're going to be about is for you to first establish your niche, your purpose, your vision, you know, all those big things, and then condense them down into a very short statement like this, an elevator speech. This is what your business is about. This is what your organization is about. Now, everything else you do, whatever it is during your daily operations, has to relate back to that one thing. If it doesn't, you're working across purposes with yourself and you need to throw it out. Either re-relate it to that core statement or get rid of it because it's not helping you get to your goal. And Brother Lawrence follows this to a T. Everything he does relates to God's presence. Everything he talks about relates back to God's presence. And then when he gives us his little elevator speech, it's all about the practice of presence. That's our calling. That's what being a follower of Jesus is all about, is practicing presence. Pretty clear, pretty simple, hard to do. All right. Any last comments?
Dave, you said earlier, and this was, I don't know why this struck me when you said we were created in God's image. And I've always thought of that as a physical thing, like, you know, and I don't know why that thought never occurred to me that we're not talking about a physical.
It's amazing how that works, isn't it, William? We get these thoughts stuck in our mind from childhood and they just don't leave us. And even though, you know, of course we've evolved since then, you know, mentally, physically, emotionally, and every other way. And yet those little buggers are still down there limiting our vision, you know. But, you know, I would say what really, that part of us that is mostly created in God's image is our ability to choose. You know, to have eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, to be able to choose between the two is the part of us that's created in God's image, because that's the part of us that allows us to love. Without a free choice, we can't love. Love, if it's coerced in any way, is not love anymore. And so that part of us that can choose is the part of us that I think is created in God's image. And that's the part of us we're going to find in our deepest self. Our egoic mind has limited our choices. It's created a scenario in which we're just kind of automatons, just kind of running through, you know, stimulus and response. You know, we really don't have any choices in between until we become aware enough that we can insert a choice between the stimulus and the response. And then everything changes.
You know, what you were just reading and what, Dave, what brought to my mind was, early on in my days in catechism as a child, we were presented, in my mind, a picture of Jesus coming, like being driven up in a limousine. And I instinctually knew at the time, or believed at the time, he was so much more than that. I mean, I've always felt that. And perhaps that was going on with the beginning of my separation spiritually, you know, with me from the church. But I continued to practice that religion on and off through my entire life. Yet knowing that you know, that belief that, you know, Jesus did not arrive in a limo with servants. He's just always been there, and he's greater than all that. And he's and that also rises the question of people ask, well, where were you when I needed you? Well, I knew when I needed him that he was there. I instinctually have known my entire life, in my number of years I've been on this planet, that he's always been there. And if I've acknowledged his presence, you know, he's had my back my whole life. Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't know how much more simple I can break it down to than that, but that's basically it. And so when I talk about him in different circles, you know, I describe him as the big guy in the sky, which is humorous to some and kind of, yeah, right, with others, but you know, he's greater than all that, and always has been.
Well, John, if you've always had a sense of God's presence and backing, then you're a better man than I am, Gunga Din.
No.
I'll tell you what, it was a street fight for me to try to get to some sense of God's presence around me. But
I've always known he's there. I've never considered myself someone who is really above it all. I mean, I've always considered myself, you know, felt myself to be humbly small, if you will.
Practicing presence, that's it for Brother Lawrence. He's going to keep coming back to that over and over again. And it's a good thing, because it's going to take a while for all of this to really get tamped down into our spirit in a place where it actually becomes usable. Because as long as it's just thoughts in our head, it's not yet. So as we go through this, we're going to get this repeated over and over, which is a good thing, as I say. All right, we are at time, and we actually have Scott here with us. So
Still here, live and in person.
so great, Scott. And
I'm glad I could join you
You've
guys.
been right in on it. You've been just, you know, just happening and aware and eye contact. So
What did you just say?
Yeah, I know. Would you close us in prayer, Scotty?
I'd be more than happy to. Family, you're all so beautiful, and God, you overwhelm us. We can't conceive and imagine in our greatest moments of connection. There's infinitely more of you. We never run out of you. There's nothing we face, nothing that comes against us, nothing that we stand up to, nothing that we can't go through. As long as we acknowledge who we were created by, and that's you, Father God. We're so blessed that sometimes it's more than we can bear to stay focused on it, to stay present to it, because it's mind-boggling, as I'm sure you know already. So, Father, take our understanding, our peace, our questioning, our seeking, our desire for knowledge and how to connect more and go deeper, and this curiosity we have. which must be a curiosity trait that is available from you. You're curious to see what we're going to do with what's been given to us. I can only imagine, Father God. We're just so blessed. We love you, Lord. Thank you that you're always there, that you are always present, even when we are not. You are always present. You have our back. We can count on you. If you are for us, who can be against us? Your holy word declares your truth, and it's in your truth that we pray, we give our thanks, we say our amens. In your mighty name, Lord Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Yeah.
Thank you, Scotty.
Thank
Absolutely.
Heartfelt. Okay,
Love you
everybody.
guys.
See you on Sunday. Sunday,
Love you guys.
Sunday.
Take
Talk to you
care.
soon.
Bye. Bye-bye, everybody.
Hi, Judy.
Bye-bye,
Good night, everyone. Good
Jordana.
night, Sherry. Thank you for being here, dear. So good to
Yeah.
see your smiling face.
Sure is.
Yeah, yeah. And you too, Judy.
Oh, yeah, me too. Absolutely. I was a
right.
little late because I was going through last week's that I missed.
Well, at least you got caught up. That's
I
good.
did.
That's
Almost.
perfect.
I got about 20 minutes more to like listen to. So
All
there
right.
you go.
Go back and
Thank
do
you.
your homework.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And
Thanks.
bye, Jordana, and bye, Linda. See you
Okay,
guys.
see you guys
Enjoy
on
the
Sunday.
weekend. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.